Hi everybody, just a moment. We'll wait for a few more people to come online. Okay, everybody, we'll make a start. Welcome to this webinar on customer hardship policies. Please let me know if you can't hear me or anything's going wrong. Sometimes there's a few technical difficulties. So I will just bear with me one moment and I will share screen with you. Okay. Okay, sorry, where am I? Just a moment. Need to get back to the start. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how to develop and implement a customer hardship program. So apologies that today's seminar is basically a wall of text on each slide. This is not the kind of topic that it's easy to bring pictures and diagrams into. But basically the reason why we wanted to give a webinar on customer hardship programs is this is something that we've had a lot of experience with recently with helping a lot of new retailers come online, mainly in the National Energy Customer Framework jurisdictions. So that's New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, ACT and South Australia, but also supporting some clients in Victoria. So what is a customer hardship program? Well, it sets out a retailer's approach to supporting customers experiencing financial hardship. At the core of the hardship program is the customer hardship policy. So the customer hardship policy sets out how the retailer will identify customers who are experiencing hardship, the options that they will have for supporting those customers. Also, it sets out what some of the consequences are if participation in the customer hardship program is not working out. But the customer hardship policy is only one part of the program. When thinking about the program as a whole, retailers need to think about what are my customer service practices, how are our frontline customer service staff identifying and dealing with hardship customers and potentially passing them on to a specialist hardship team. Also thinking about how do all our policies in the organisation join together. So it's not just about thinking about a customer hardship policy on its own. You also need to think about what the connection is between the customer hardship policy and the risk management policy, the internal audit policy, the credit management policy, a whole host of other things that customer hardship policies could affect. So it's a requirement to have a customer hardship program right throughout the national electricity market jurisdictions. So that's all the states I mentioned before in Victoria, and in both electricity and gas retail. So my focus today is mainly going to be on electricity retail because that's where most of our experience has been to date. It's mainly a requirement through the National Energy Retail Law in those NECF states, and in Victoria it's a requirement in both the Energy Retail Code and their Electricity Industry Act. One important distinction to make is that hardship programs are related to but distinct from payment plans and policies in general for customers that are experiencing payment difficulties. So Division 6 of the NERL deals with customers in hardship programs. Division 7 deals with customers with payment difficulties. The key point being it's not necessary to be a member of the hardship program for a customer to have a payment plan in place. There's also similar obligations to those that exist with respect to hardship customers for retailers for the customers of exempt sellers and embedded networks. So again, I'll get into some of the specific details later, but there's requirements around providing customers with flexible payment options, with providing them with energy efficiency advice, with providing them on advice on access to concessions and rebates, very similar to the expectations for retail customers. Just a moment, I have a question there. Oh, sorry, the echo. Sorry about that. I'm not sure. Maybe if I turn down my volume a bit, is that helping at all? Maybe if I sit back a little bit. Just give me some feedback if there's further feedback, if anything's improving it or it stays the same. Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite sure what to do about that. Sorry about that. So what I was saying, the similar obligations exist in the case of embedded networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all those obligations that exist in relation to hardship programs, but my focus really today is not going to be on just those obligations, but thinking about innovation and developing hardship policies and how to ensure compliance within the business. So one of the things that we're picking up is that while on the whole, retailers are complying with the requirements of hardship programs, the minimum requirements in the National Energy Retail Law and the Victorian framework, we're not seeing a lot of creativity in thinking about other options beyond those minimum standards for dealing with customers experiencing financial difficulty. Okay. So, why the focus on hardship policies? Well, I mentioned that this is something we've been dealing with quite a lot recently, and I thought it would be useful to feedback some of the feedback we're getting to people in the sector generally. But there's also some statistics suggesting that there's ongoing issues for customers experiencing hardship in Australia. Again, I'm focused on the national electricity market, so that's the eastern and southeastern states. So, disconnections are on the increase. While the overall increase across the national electricity market is relatively small over the last year, in last year's AER annual report on compliance and performance in the retail energy market, that showed that they were up 16% in Queensland and 10% in ACT. So we could see that there are some areas where disconnections are really increasing. Now, of course, the connection with this and hardship policies is that a prime rationale for the hardship policy is that disconnecting a customer is a last resort. So that should only ever happen after all the prior attempts to help the customer meet their payment obligations have failed. So an increase in disconnections suggests that there's a problem there. But overall, the proportion of customers receiving hardship assistance remains low and pretty steady. It's not increasing from year to year. Most jurisdictions report fewer than 1% of total customers are in hardship programs. However, there has been a significant increase in the number of customers being placed on payment plans. So this was described on page 33 of that report from the AER last year. And what that may suggest is that some customers who were otherwise formally within customer hardship programs are being moved out of the hardship program and into the ordinary payment plan framework. For some customers, this might be a good thing, but for some other customers, they will lose out on the other assistance options that are available as part of a hardship program. Final statistic here, of electricity customers in hardship programs, only 27% exited successfully. Again, that was in that year from the AER compliance report. The rate of customers exiting hardship programs due to exclusion increased from 46% to 57% that year. So that suggests that obviously customers are not successfully completing the hardship program. In some sense, the existing hardship program framework is not working. Okay. So I just wanted to look at some more specific example, moving away from the statistics, some specific examples that were identified by the ACCC in its Retail Electricity Pricing Inquiry final report, which was released a couple of years ago. So this just identified some particular areas where there were problems. It wasn't saying that these are widespread, but it just wanted to highlight some of them. So one case it mentioned was a retailer's strategy to encourage customer engagement, quote, disconnect as a means to encourage engagement. Now this is clearly the wrong approach. In fact, that is totally non-compliant and contrary to the national, to the NERL and the NERR. Because, as I mentioned before, disconnection is to be seen as a last resort. If a retailer is struggling to talk to a customer about their difficulties in payment, they need to find another way. Another observation is that some smaller retailers have taken an inflexible approach towards negotiating payment arrangements and show reluctance to provide medium to long-term support for consumers experiencing hardship. This is something that I think coheres with our experience with dealing with a lot of smaller retailers. It's much more difficult to for a smaller retailer to be able to afford the kind of long-term and full support that some of the bigger retailers are able to offer. Finally, at the bottom there, at least one small retailer has strongly encouraged hardship customers who had made a request for assistance to transfer away to another retailer. So again, the NERL, the NERR set out clear rules around how retailers should be dealing with hardship customers, and this isn't the way to go about it. So, again, those are just some examples that were highlighted in the ACCC report. They weren't supposed to describe a general experience with retailers. In fact, generally, there is not widespread non-compliance. See, there's this quote here from the Essential Services Commission. So that's the regulator in Victoria who carried out an energy hardship inquiry in 2016. And again, they recognised that there were areas where hardship programs weren't working for customers, but they weren't laying the blame at retailers for non-compliance. So what's our experience been? Well, in response to some of these issues that are coming up with the current customer hardship framework, suggesting that things aren't working, both regulators are closely scrutinising hardship policies before approval. So once the hardship policy has been designed by the retailer, it needs to get approval from one of the regulators, and then after that it has to be published on the website of the retailer. So what are some of the things that are being scrutinised and that might be areas where retailers could improve? Well, as I mentioned right at the start, there's a perception that retailers could be more innovative in their offerings, i.e. offering more than the minimum requirements. So this is about recognising that while some of the core options that are to be provided, payment plans, energy efficiency advice, review of market retail contracts, I'll get more to those obligations in a moment, but some of these don't work for all, not all of these options are going to work for all customers. So it's a good idea for retailers to think about how they could tailor their assistance more to the specific circumstances of a particular customer. So something that we've noticed is it's relatively uncommon for there to be, for example, debt waiver or partial debt suspension in customer hardship policies. Now, these aren't requirements. The National Energy Retail Rules, NERR, clearly set out that the retailer is allowed to offer such an option, but not very many retailers are. Now, this is not to suggest that, for example, debt waiver should necessarily be offered as a standard policy to all customers, but rather that retailers can think about whether that is an option that would suit some customers in some circumstances. Next thing I wanted to mention is retailers taking an overly exclusionary approach to entering into the Customer Hardship Program. So again, I'll mention the obligations shortly, but as part of their Customer Hardship Policy, a retailer needs to have a range of methods of identifying customers who are experiencing or may be experiencing financial hardship. And in doing that, they need to be careful not to make it too difficult for customers to enter into the program. And this relates back to that prior point I mentioned from AER's review last year, that we're seeing a, small but significant increase of customers going onto payment plans but not being part of the Customer Hardship Program. So that suggests perhaps that customers who would otherwise or should otherwise be going on to the Customer Hardship Program are not doing so. Perhaps that's because they're being excluded. Finally, I just wanted to discuss, in terms of our experience, how hardship policies could be better integrated with other policies and systems. So, a customer experiencing hardship obviously has implications for a range of aspects of the business. First of all, it's a compliance concern. There's a range of compliance obligations in the National Energy Retail Law, the National Energy Retail Rules, and a range of guidance around hardship that the retailer has to comply with, and many of these obligations, the breach of them are subject to, can be subject to civil penalties and AER enforcement. So there is a serious compliance issue there, so the hardship policy needs to be integrated into that wider compliance management system and compliance policy. Likewise, risk management policies. So every retailer, as a requirement of their registration, should have a risk management program and policy in place. They should have a risk register where they list all the risks that they foresee in their business and consider how likely they are to, these circumstances are to occur, and how significant the consequences would be of those circumstances occurring. And because failure to comply with a hardship policy can result in disconnection for a customer, this is obviously a serious risk for a retailer. Again, in terms of compliance, but not just compliance, in terms of reputational risk for disconnections, and also in relation to customers being disconnected who under the retail law shouldn't be. Okay. So, I've gone a little bit back to front. I've talked about some of the stats and some of our experiences, and I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail now about what the hardship policy, the core hardship policy requirements are in the NECF. So, first of all, at the highest level, they're set out in the National Energy Retail Law. So the key requirements of a hardship policy are set out in section 44. So that includes, as I mentioned before, identification processes. So processes within the business for monitoring payment regularity, monitoring customers getting into arrears, processes that allow a customer to self-identify as experiencing hardship. There's also requirements in that section around early response. So again, that's connected to identification. The organisation needs to make sure that when it's debt, it provides a program for those customers early on. Flexible payment options. So this is probably the primary assistance that is usually offered through a hardship program, where a customer is, for example, given the opportunity to pay their bills up front or to pay on a different level of regularity compared to standard customers. Notification of concessions and rebates, so the retailer is required to inform the customer about where they can access information about government assistance. Another requirement set out there is around market contract review. So if the hardship customer is on a market retail contract, then the retailer needs to consider as an option where it needs to consider reviewing that policy to see if there's anything that could be altered to better help that customer. The provision of energy efficiency information. So this could be simply referring the customer to various sources of information, or it could actually be providing energy efficiency specialist advice as a retailer. And again, I just wanted to emphasize there something I mentioned before, and the kind of overarching principle guiding hardship policies and hardship programs is that disconnection is a last resort. So those are the key requirements set out in the retail law, and then the retail rules set out in more detail a range of matters to do with those obligations, primarily set out in Rules 72 to 76. So these include obligations to communicate hardship policies to customers. There's requirements to structure payment plans in a certain way, so the retailer needs to take into account, for example, the customer's ability to pay, their current financial circumstances, how that affects their ability to comply to a particular payment plan. There's a requirement to waive late payment fees, and it sets out more in detail those processes around identification, and also specifying that payment for customers on payment plans may happen via CenterPay. Another requirement related to hardship policies in the NERR is Rule 40, Sub-Rule 3, security deposits can't be required of these customers. And then finally, just mentioning there that the NERR does talk about debt waiver. It doesn't say it needs to be offered as an option to customers. It just mentions that nothing in the